1 Corinthians, I don't know if Paul meant to do this or not, and I know he was writing to a rough bunch. 1 Corinthians chapter 7 was 3 weeks of some of the hardest sermons I've ever had to preach. Those sermons on marriage were really rough. And we're dealing with one today in chapter 11. It's in the same genre as those were. It's something we all need to know, but very few of us understand. And it's really very misunderstood in our world today about how to have a Christian order. God is a God of order. And just look at the universe. Everything is in order, in His order. And God is a God of order. The Bible says God is not a God of confusion, and He's not. He is. So He expects us, as He says in verse 1, Paul says, be imitators of me, just as I also am of Christ. Something was said one time, I don't forget who said it, but he said, follow no one any farther than they follow Christ. A lot of wisdom in that statement. You know, we have so many so-called athletes out here, or famous figures out here today, and people that they want to look up to and people they want to follow. But sadly, we have very few people, role models to follow anymore. They're fewer and far between. But we're called as Christians to follow Christ. In fact, that's what the word Christian means, little Christ. We are to be, when Jesus said, when you've seen me, you've seen the Father, we should live our life in such a way that we can say to people, when you've seen me, you've seen Jesus. That's what's expected of us. When you've seen me, you've seen Jesus. Not to mean we're equal to Jesus, just to mean that when you see us, you're seeing someone who's trying to live like Jesus lived. And that's what we're called to do. And God has an order for these things. And He expects us to do certain things. Of course, Jesus was one of the greatest evangelists that ever lived, wasn't He? And He expects us to do the same. Adrian Rogers told of a little boy that got saved in children's church. That's why I think children's church is so important. I think they can learn so much back there. You don't think they're learning, but they're picking it up. And they're learning. And this little boy got saved in children's church. And the children's church teacher told him, said, you need to go over to big church and tell the pastor that you got saved in children's church and you need to get baptized. Well, the little boy didn't quite understand exactly what he said, but he thought he had it, so he went over and he pulled the preacher aside, and he said, Pastor, he said, yes. He said, he told me to tell you that I got saved and I need to get advertised. Well, you know, there's a lot of truth in that statement, too. You see, you are a walking, talking advertisement. Whether you like it or not. You say, well, I don't want to be an advertisement. It's too late. If you claim to be a Christian, you will be an advertisement for or against. But you will be an advertisement. And that's what he's talking about here today in chapter 11 of 1 Corinthians. Christian order. And we're going to get into something today. And this is God's order. And boy, it's been mistaken by so many people and corrupted. The text has been corrupted, how they explained it. Hopefully we'll have a better understanding of it when we finish here today. He said, now I praise you because you remember me in everything and hold firmly to the traditions just as I delivered them to you. But I want you to understand that Christ is the head of every man, and the man is the head of a woman, and God is the head of Christ. Now, at verse 3 I just read you there's a lot of places you could read that right there today, and there's a lot of women's head would just explode. Well, no man's going to be head of me. Well, then you're not going to be in God's will. It's that simple. But then they don't understand what headship is. This is not, let me just say this before I go to it any further. When God speaks of headship, he's not talking about master-slave, okay? So let's just get past that and then look at what God's talking about. Every woman who has something on his, or every man who has something on his head while praying or prophesying disgraces his head. That's why when men come into church, actually had a couple times, I've had somebody didn't know any better, especially I remember back in Carolina a couple times, young people came to visit the church and wore their caps. And I didn't call them out. I just went back and leaned over. I said, you just need to take your cap off in here. Of course, the way we were raised, at least the way I was raised, when you walked in the house, your cap came off anyway.
Amen. That's right.
So when you walked in God's house, you know, but they didn't understand that, and it's like we with the kids in children's church. There's so much, so well, maybe the kids don't want to do this, or kids don't know how to do this, and kids. Why do you think we have children's church? Did you know how to act the first time you went to church? Hopefully over the years you've learned and you've grown. But the only way you can do that is to listen and to learn and to grow, and you keep growing, hopefully, if you want to. But believe me, nobody knows it all, and you'll never know it all. I know a few people think they do, but they don't. But every woman who has her head uncovered while praying or prophesying disgraces her head, for she is one and the same as the woman whose head is shaved. Now, why would he use that terminology? A woman who has her head uncovered. One of the things I remember in the 50s growing up, I remember going to church, and I loved the ladies' hats. Oh, now I can still go with some of my black friends. I go to their churches. Man, they dress out. Yeah, we go into black. I've preached in a black church too, and I've been to several with some friends of mine who are black pastors. And you go in black church. Now they know how to dress for church. They dress out, folks.
That's right.
And those ladies that come in with some hats like you have never seen. It's like a comparison of hats. Here, look at that and look at that. And you sit there and look at hats all morning if you're not careful. And in fact, we used to go to the pastor's conference in Jacksonville, Florida. And every Sunday morning there was a lady that came in every Sunday. She was a faithful member. And she was called the Hat Lady, because it seemed like she wore a different hat every Sunday, and that she had some hats that would stand out. And she was known as the Hat Lady. And I love the hats, by the way. I love the hats on women in churches. I thought they were just wonderful. I loved them. My mama used to wear several hats that she wore to church. But he's talking about something here that I don't think that was really related to this. Maybe that's where it was handed down from. I don't know. But there's a reason that a woman should have her head covered. Because of God's creation and God's order. If a woman does not cover her head, let her also have her hair cut off. If it is disgraceful for a woman to have her hair cut off or her head shaved, let her cover her head. Now, he's getting pretty harsh here. But now, you have to take everything in context of where it was, who he was speaking to, what the customs were in that day. Why was he pointing this out to be so important for women to have their heads covered? He's in Corinth. Corinth had temple prostitutes. Very popular in that town. They went around with their heads uncovered, their hair flowing, their jewelry on, and their makeup, enticing the men to come to the temple. Paul's saying, unless you want to be confused with one of the temple prostitutes, then you need to cover your head. Because if you want to go around with your head uncovered, then don't be surprised if somebody mistakes you for one of the temple prostitutes. We could take that to today's way that the dress in some churches. Some people, our dress code is very simple. Prefer it to be clean and keep it modest. Period. And I say, well, what do you consider modest? Well, if you're married, there's certain things that no man should see except the husband.
That's right.
So you just keep it that way and you'll be fine. But there's some people that think they can go to church dressed like they would out at Walmart, and then that's fine with God. Well, it's not fine with God. This is God's house. And God is to be honored in his house. So, but it goes further than dress. It goes further than hair. It goes further than dress. And that's what I want to get to today. That's what I want to point out to you. And I noticed how he sort of lays the groundwork here by praising the people. Because Paul's getting ready to bring down some pretty harsh teaching here. And before you bring down harsh teaching, it's always good to sort of praise the people a little bit. And, you know, he soften them up a little bit, if you will, before he hammers them with the hard teaching. And Paul was pretty good about that most of the time. So, he said, for a man ought not to have his head covered, since he is the image and the glory of God, but the woman is the glory of man. For man does not originate from woman, but woman from man. Now, for indeed, man was not created for the woman's sake, but woman for the man's sake. There's a mouthful there. There is a lot of theology right there. The man is made in the image of God. Back in Genesis, when God said he was going to create man, what did he do? In fact, it's spoken of in the Trinity speaking, it's spoken of in the plural. Did not God say, let us make man, us, make man in our image? Now, how you can get around the Trinity there and get around being God being a pluralistic being, I don't know. He didn't say, I'm going to make man in my image. He said, let us make man in our image. And then he gathered up some dust and he formed man. But it was just a pile of dust. And then God breathed life into it, and he became man. God created man in his image. I have a theory here, and I can't prove it, and you can't disprove it. And I guess it'd be a controversial theory, but I think it makes sense. I believe the first couple, Adam and Eve, were the first interracial couple. What color is dirt? What did he make man out of? Then he said, man needs a helpmate. So he put him to sleep. And then he took what from Adam? A rib. What color is a rib? Then he closed up his side. Without getting too technical and getting too far into it, if you believe the Bible, now if you don't believe the Bible, anything I'm saying doesn't make any sense, you're just wasting your time anyway. But if you believe the Bible, the Genesis account is how mankind started, Adam and Eve. We started with two people, Adam and Eve. Now let's just use some common sense, which has sort of disappeared today, sort of extinct. But if you have two white people and they have a baby, what color is the baby going to be? This is not a trick question. White. If you have two black people and they have a baby, what color is the baby going to be? Is everybody in this world either white or black? Now, if everybody in this world is white or black, and variations of it, obviously it couldn't have come from one color. Does that make sense? If our first two parents were white, then everybody should be, throughout history, white. If they were Jewish, everybody should have been Jewish. If they were black, everyone should be black. Well, People don't like to hear that, but they don't like to hear about Moses, because when Moses took his wife, Zipporah, she was an Ethiopian. And Aaron got very upset with him. How dare him marry an Ethiopian woman, a black woman? You know, we're the ones that destroyed the race, started the racist thing.
That's right.
We're the ones that act like one race is inferior to another because they're different from us. Well, let me just tell you something. The other side, I've got some really, really good black friends, and they told me they've got as many racists over there as we have over here. But racism is taught. It's taught, just like hatred's taught. Now, I can't prove that's right, but to me, if you take two white people, you're going to have nothing but white all the way through the generations. If you have, or Jews, or Indian, or Japanese, or black, whatever, you name the race. Of course, we always separated them after the flood into three different groups, and that's a whole different sermon. So he said he made man in his image, since he is the image and the glory of God. But the woman is the glory of man. Now, he didn't say the woman was the slave of man. He said, Adam needs a helpmate. He said, all these other creatures that I've created, I've got two of each one of those, but poor old Adam's by himself. Adam needs a helpmate. He needs someone, here it is, he needs someone to complete him. Eve completed Adam. Why do you think he said in the Bible, when a man and woman get married, they leave their father and mother, and the two become one? Folks, when a man and woman do it God's way, when you get married, you become one in his sight. But now, there is an order in that. And that's what we're looking at today. The man was created in God's image. And the woman was to be subordinate to the man. Now, let me go into a little more detail here as to why. Therefore, the woman ought to have a symbol of authority on her head because of the angels. Well, what's he talking about? Genesis chapter 24 and verse 65. We're going to have a couple of PowerPoints today. She said to the servant, who is that man walking in the field of meat? And the servant just answered her. He said, that's my master. And she put a veil over her face and covered herself. He's talking about Isaac when he was bringing his bride to him. He was the master. He was going to be her husband. And she was subordinating herself to his authority. But in 1 Peter, the New Testament, chapter 3, verse 7, he said, your husbands, here's the other side of the coin, you husbands in the same way, live with your wives in an understanding way, as with someone weaker. A lot of women don't want to hear that. But hey, folks, admit it or not, overall, women are weaker than men. That's why we're having so much a debate right now about all these transgender men identifying as women, and all of a sudden, athletes that used to be, couldn't even qualify, now are going over to women's sports and winning gold medals. It's not fair. God did not make our bodies the same. He did not make the woman's body as strong, overall, generally speaking, as the male body. So she is the weaker vessel. But if she's a weaker vessel, then men, we are required to do something. Since she is a woman, show her honor as a fellow heir, equal, and the grace of life, so that your prayers, I wish every man in the United States could just read this one time, especially the last part, so that your prayers will not be hindered. You cannot treat your wife like a dog and expect God to listen to your prayers.
That's right.
And there's some people that used to come here, I wish were here right now this morning to listen to this, but they're not. But in the culture of that time, remember, I'll tell you, everything we study here You have to study the culture. You have to understand what culture it was given in, what they expected. In that day and time, back in that culture, for a person to have their head covered was a shame, sign of shame or of subjection, one of the two. When people were captured, they would cover their heads as they walked them in line or tortured them. They would cover their heads. And it was a sign for the men of subjection, of shame. But now, for the women, it was different. And here's what we're going to look at, and what we've been looking at. The point that God's trying to make. He said, however, in the Lord, neither is woman independent of man, nor is man independent of woman. For as the woman originates from the man, so also the man has his birth through the woman, and all things originate from God. The first woman came from man.
Amen.
Ever since then, every man has come from woman. So he said she is his co-equal. She is his co-equal with him. She is equal with him, same with him, independent. They're independent, but they're not independent of each other once they're married. And he calls on us, in I don't have any PowerPoints, but in Ephesians chapter 5, he said that women, you are to be in subjection to your husband. And that's where a lot of people, a lot of the women want to stop right there. I don't want to hear any more. Well, you probably want to hear the next verse or two. And then he says, but men, you are to love your wife as Christ loved the church. How much did Christ love the church? He died for it. Are you telling me that any woman would not be willing to subject herself to the authority of her husband, not as her master, but simply as her cover, who she knew was willing to die for her? That would give his life for her? I can't know if I can remember it or not. I just thought of a story that I read about that years ago. A man was brought before the king, was going to be killed for treason. And he brought his wife and children with him, and he stood before the king, and the king asked him, he said, do you have anything to say for yourself? He says, no, sir. He said, I have nothing to say except, could I plead with you that whatever you do to me, please, would you spare my wife and not kill her? And the king so admired what the man said. He said, I'm going to give you your life. And they left. And after they left, the man said to the woman, he said, yeah, did you see all the gold and everything around that, inside that castle? She says, I didn't notice it. He said, did you see that crown that king was wearing? He said, well, she said, I didn't notice it. He said, well, what did you notice? She said, all I could see was the man who was willing to die for me. What woman would not subject herself to the authority? Now that authority means, this is God. Man puts himself under God's authority. He's my cover. He's our cover. We're under his authority as long as we obey him and serve him. The woman puts herself under the man's authority, but by doing so, she's also putting herself under God's authority. If the woman removes herself from under the man's authority, she's also removing herself from under God's authority. If the man removes himself from under God's authority, then he's leaving her unprotected because she comes under his authority. God has an order for things. It's not about inferiority. It's not about who can do what. It's God's order. Here's the simple fact. God created Adam first.
Yes.
He created Adam in his image. It's never, nowhere in the Bible does it say he created Eve in his image. He created man in his image. Then he created Eve as a helpmate, to be his equal, to come alongside him, to complete him. Preacher was preaching on that one time, so when you get married, he said, you're completed. And the guy said, you're right about that. He said, boy, when you get married, you're done. And I don't think that's what the text meant, but anyway, that's how some people look at it. For as the woman originates from the man, so also through birth, him from the woman. Judge for yourself. Is it proper for a woman to pray to God with her head uncovered? Does not even nature itself teach you that if a man has long hair, it's a dishonor to him? Boy, I can think a bunch of people today need to read that one. But if one is inclined to be contentious, we have no other Pneumonia left me with a little bit of a cough. We have no other practice, nor have the churches of God. But, you know, we live in a society today. How many times have you seen somebody you couldn't tell if it was a man or a woman?
Yes.
I had an incident at a drugstore a week or two ago, had a problem with somebody, and I was talking to the manager about it. And I told the manager, I said, this person had real skinny, had real long hair. And I said, they spoke to me, and I still don't know if it was a man or boy or girl. I don't know. And he had to tell me. You know, he said, well, that was a girl. She's not going to be here long, but that was a girl. And but I couldn't tell. God never meant for it to be that confusing, folks. Women should be easy to recognize. And men should be able to differentiate a man from a woman. And we've got into a confused society today, I'm afraid. And another thing, the men in Corinth, there's another problem. The women would go around with their heads uncovered, their hair flowing. The men would cut their hair short, which was against God's order of things. So then we got two problems going on here. So this is all, as we look at this text, this is all about, it's not about inferiority or, you know, who is better than the other. In God's eyes, we're equal, but he has an order for doing things. And some people can't accept that. They just can't accept that at all. Or some people would tell you, so, well, I'd never vote for a woman for president. Well, I haven't seen one yet, but that's not saying if I saw the right one. I've seen a couple running that I thought might be pretty good candidates. I know some little girls right now that could probably do better than one we've got, but you know, to differentiate like that and say, well, I wouldn't vote for somebody because of their sex. I wouldn't vote somebody because of their race. You're leaving a lot of people out when you do that. But some people can be so bigoted and so mean-spirited. I read several years ago of farmers were having a farmers meeting and discussing some issues, and everybody they had their say pretty much. And this one woman, farmer's wife, stood up and said, "I'd like to say something." And one of the big old farmers there, he says, "Well, so what do you got to say?" He said, I doubt if she even knows how many toes a pig's got." And she looked at him and said, "You're right, I don't." So why don't you take your shoes and socks off? So it's easy to be prejudiced. But folks, as I said about hatred a while ago, racism and prejudice is also taught. God did not create us to be separated. God created us to love one another. When God sees you, he doesn't see white or black or Japanese or Chinese. God sees his children. He sees his creation. We become his children when we ask him to forgive us of our sins and come into our life. If you've got prejudice toward anything or anybody, it's been taught to you growing up. You weren't born with it. I promise you, you could go out and get your little playpen, bring it right up here, and go out and find me a little Japanese, a little black boy, a little white one, and get me a little girl, get me a little, maybe a German, a little Russian, put them all in there with some toys and watch them. You know what they'll do? They'll play with each other. Because nobody yet has taught them to hate each other. Hate is taught, and it doesn't come from God. That's why this country is so divided right now. Our country has never been more divided than it is right now. There is so much hatred in this country right now. If you don't agree with me, I hate you. You have no say. You have nothing to say. I don't want to hear anything you have to say. Well, folks, if you don't want to hear anything the other side's got to say, you're never going to know what you're up against. We need to debate issues. If you have a point, this is what I think. Well, this is what I think and why I think, and why do you think that? You know. But as long as you want to do is argue and fight with each other, all you're going to have is mass killings like we're having on the streets right now. There's no desire for people today to live together. There's no respect for life. And that all comes from getting out of God's order. God created us to love one another. Love the Lord your God with all your heart. And love your neighbor as yourself. And then the rich young ruler tried to justify himself. But Master, who is my neighbor? He thought, well, now if I can just narrow that down, I've got this made. You know, who's my neighbor? You talking about my next door neighbor, the ones that live on my street? He let him know that everyone. And folks, that's more today than it was then. Today, we're so connected worldwide. Our neighbor can live on the other side of the world. We can talk to them like that. We can have FaceTime with them like that. God said we're to love one another. The reason our world is upside down, the reason we're in such a mess as we are, is because we've gotten things out of God's order. God said, I am over man. I cover him with my protection. If the woman will submit to his authority, not his slave, not he's the master and she's the slave, or some would really like to play on that. No, he said, you're equal, but you come under his protection. And he said, husbands, you love your wife as Christ loved the church. Christ died for the church. Amen. And there's not a man, if you love your wife, you should be willing to die for your wife. And if you're not, she needs another husband. Father, we thank you today as you give us this text because it's a hard text. But it's also one of the most misunderstood, misexplained texts in the entire Scripture.